the buying into the narrative that America broadly writ is guilty for the sins of people like Derek Chauvin, that every one of those instances can be broadened out and blamed on American hierarchies of power, is a trope that has a predictable endpoint. And the predictable endpoint is the disintegration of the country. That is the predictable endpoint. When you see people as a member of a group, everyone is a member of a group that is either guilty or innocent. The only way you can expiate your guilt, by the way, is by posting some sort of black box on your Twitter or Instagram. That's how you do your sacrifice in the temple to expiate your sins so you can get forgiveness. This is not the way that a country comes together. This is the way a country falls apart, by holding people accountable for things they did not do and for holding the system accountable for laws that no longer exist. If you're going to talk about systemic racism, there are really only a couple ways to define systemic racism. One is practices and laws that are innately discriminatory. Jim Crow, housing bias, right? The things that are innately discriminatory. We all oppose them, and they are against federal law. Okay, then there is a second way to define systemic discrimination, and that is disparate impact. Disparate impact is the idea that if you pass a law and has a disparate impact on one group, meaning one group is harder hit than another group, that this is an element of racism. I will not endorse that version of systemic racism, because every single law that has ever been passed in human history impacts groups differently. The question is whether the law is directed at the group. But you see the conflation, right? The conflation is, okay, if black Americans by and large are poorer than white Americans, then that must be because of systemic racism. We can't look at any of the other factors. If more black Americans on a population level adjusted basis are shot by the police than white Americans, then we immediately have to announce that this is an aspect of American racism. We can't look to any other factor. The simple inequality is the inequity. The fact that it is that group statistics are not identical across groups is evidence that the system is discriminating in favor of certain people against other people. Perfect example of this sort of bizarre and unfounded logic today in the New York Times. Minneapolis police use force against black people at 7 times the rate of whites. Hey, now, the first question for anybody who sees that headline is, okay, so why are the Minneapolis police encountering more black criminals than white criminals? And are those based on actual phone calls from people reporting crimes? Right? Because let me give you another example. Virtually all Americans who go to prison for violent crimes are men. Virtually none are women. Does that mean that the system is unequal with regard to men and women, or does it mean that men are committing more crimes than women in terms of violent crimes? Wouldn't you want to know that before you declare the system innately inequitable, innately systemically discriminatory against men? The answer is, of course you would. So if the question is, how many people are being shot by police? The second question should be, okay, and how many people committed crimes? Because if you look at the Washington Post database of how many people in America were black and unarmed and shot by police in 2019, this is the Washington Post database, the answer in 2019 was 9. If you want to talk about the number of black Americans who were shot who are unarmed and who are not fleeing from police, the answer is 3. Does that sound like the extermination of black people across the country? It does not. Nowhere in this New York Times piece, not a single place, do they actually talk about differential crime rates by race. Now, again, that's not racist. It is not racist to point out that there are differential crime statistics any more than it is racist to point out that there are differential statistics when it turns to police officers shooting people. Hey, a statistic is a statistic. Statistics are not racist. They're just statistics. Hey, but apparently, if you point out that a disproportionate share of crime is committed by young black men, this is racist. But if you point out that a disproportionate share of young black men are shot by police, then this is woke. How about both of those are stats and they are related stats, but we're not allowed to point that out. We just have to attribute the disparity, the second disparity, not the first. The second disparity we are supposed to attribute to broad scale American racism. So we have this long, long article about the evils of the Minneapolis police. My favorite quote in this is from David Schultz, professor at Hamline University in St. Paul. He says, the disparities in the use of force in Minneapolis parallel large racial gaps in vital measures in the city, like income, education, and unemployment. He says it just mirrors the disparities of so many other things in which Minneapolis comes in very badly. Okay, might it mirror the disparity in crime statistics? Might it? Wouldn't that be like the number one question, considering you called the cops? This is not about random white Americans shooting random black Americans. This is about the police who are called in to deal with crime. Wouldn't you want to know what the calls actually said before you declare that the police are racist? If somebody calls up the police and says, you know, my neighbor just murdered my other neighbor. Both of them were black. And the police come and they get in an armed confrontation with the murderer. Is that a racist incident, or is that the police doing their job? That's the big question. The question isn't how many black Americans are being shot by police. The question is how many black Americans are being unjustifiably shot by police. And how does that compare with the number of white Americans being unjustifiably shot by police? And more, because that would implicate racism. And more broadly, how many Americans are broadly being unjustifiably shot by police is an issue of police brutality. Okay, and that one we all agree on. But instead, we have to drive this narrative over and over and over again that every inequality is due to the innate evils of the United States. And so you saw CNN put up a piece today about racial inequalities in the United States in terms of the wealth gap. Okay, it is true that there are certain disparities in the wealth gap that are attributable to historic injustices, like redlining, for example, because so much of wealth is concentrated in home ownership, for example. But it would not explain, racism would not explain, the continuing income disparity between black Americans and white Americans, particularly because you know where there is no income disparity. If you look at parental income, if your parents are poor, you are not going to have as high an income, generally speaking, after the same period of time as somebody who's born in a rich family, which is not a particular surprise, right? You're going to grow up in a richer community. You're going to have more connections. Right? That is a class issue. That is not a race issue. But if you are, let's say that you're a black woman who is born in a wealthy black family versus a white woman born in a wealthy white family, how exactly does that turn out? Is that racism? Well, it turns out there is no income gap between black and white women raised in similar households. None. It's only among males, which might implicate behavior because it turns out that black women are also black. So again, like statistics, I know have been verboten here because we're trying to drive a narrative. It is wrong for people to try and buy their way out of conflict by buying into narratives that are going to create deeper conflicts over the nature of America. Because again, the idea that America is systemically racist and broadly racist just allows people to, number one, avoid naming and shaming and being specific about policies and people who are doing bad things, and instead allows them to say the entire system is guilty, therefore tear down the entire system. And if you don't say tear down the entire system, then you're a racist, right? That is the implication of the narrative that is being drawn. Okay, in just a second, I'm going to get to some actual police statistics, and we'll talk about systemic police racism. We'll also talk about this attempt to buy penance, particularly by woke white people who are attempting to demonstrate their bona fides by mouthing platitudes, which again does not cure racism. You know what didn't cure racism? You putting up a black square on Instagram yesterday. Racism not solved. You have accomplished zero things. And guess what? It ain't going to matter because next time there is a police officer who is white who kills a black man unjustifiably, nobody's going to care that he put up a black square 3 years ago. No one. It ain't going to matter one iota. We're going to get to all this in just 1 second. First, let's talk about the actual statistics. So Heather McDonald, who has spent her life studying the statistics on police brutality and racial disparities, she has a piece in the Wall Street Journal that is worth reading. Again, we can acknowledge that people are angry. We can acknowledge that people have anecdotal evidence of the police mistreating them. We can even acknowledge that if you are a black person living in a high crime area, there is a better chance that you had a bad run-in with a police officer than there is if you are a black person living in a high income area, or if you're a white person living in a high income area, or a white person living in a low crime area. Right? The area is determinative, and the amount of interaction between police officers and people of a particular race is determinative too. My guess is that you could find quite a bit of anecdotal evidence of police abusing Latinos in East Los Angeles, where there are high crime rates and a lot of Hispanic populations. Okay, but here's Heather McDonald talking about the myth of systemic police racism. She says, this charge of systemic police bias was wrong during the Obama years. It remains so today. However, sickening the video of Floyd's arrest, it isn't representative of the 375 million annual contacts police officers have with civilians. A solid body of evidence finds no structural bias in the criminal justice system with regard to arrests, prosecution, or sentencing. Crime and suspect behavior, not race, determine most police actions. In 2019, police officers fatally shot 1,004 people, most of whom were armed or otherwise dangerous. African Americans were about a quarter of those killed by cops last year, 235, a ratio that has remained stable since 2015. Okay, so first of all, we should note just right off the bat that police officers fatally shot 235 black people last year. There are 30 million black Americans. Does that sound like a campaign of extermination by police officers against black people? It does not. That share of black victims is less than what black crime rates would predict, since police shootings are a function of how often officers encounter armed and violent suspects. In 2018, the last year for which such data have been published, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders in the U.S. and committed about 60% of robberies, although they are 13% of the population. In fact, if you actually want to break down that subset even further, you shouldn't really use 13% of the population as a substitute because really you're talking about young black men. It is not black women who are committing homicide and robbery, right? It's a smaller percentage of the population even than that. The police fatally shot 9 unarmed blacks and 19 unarmed whites in 2019, according to the Washington Post. That is down from 38 and 32 in 2015. The Post defines unarmed broadly to include such cases as a suspect in Newark, New Jersey, who had a loaded handgun in his car during a police chase. That guy was still considered unarmed by the Post. In 2018, there were 7,400 black homicide victims. Assuming a comparable number of victims last year, those 9 unarmed black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African Americans killed in 2019. By contrast, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is likely to be killed by a police officer. On Memorial Day weekend in Chicago alone, 10 African Americans were killed in drive-by shootings. Such routine violence has continued. This past weekend, 80 Chicagoans were shot in drive-by shootings, 21 fatally, the victims overwhelmingly black. Police shootings are not the reason that blacks are dying of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Criminal violence is. The latest in a series of studies undercutting the claim of systemic police bias was published in August 2019 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The researchers found that the more frequently officers encounter violent suspects from any given racial group, the greater the chance that a member of that group will be fatally shot by the police officer. There is no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being shot by the police. A 2015 Justice Department analysis of the Philly Police Department found that white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. Research by Harvard economist Roland Fryer found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. So none of this matters, though, because the narrative must be driven.